Most people misunderstand how an empath reaches their breaking point. They imagine it as a sudden emotional explosion, a dramatic reaction after one final insult. But that's not how it works. An empath doesn't snap. An empath accumulates. What you're looking at from the outside often appears to be patience, tolerance, even weakness. But internally, something very different is happening. Every interaction is being processed not just emotionally, but cognitively. Empaths are constantly reading tone, noticing inconsistencies, tracking behavior patterns. They are absorbing not just what is said, but what is meant, what is hidden, and what is repeated. And here's where it becomes important to understand the distinction. An empath's greatest strength, their ability to feel deeply, is also what allows them to analyze deeply. This isn't blind emotion. It's emotional intelligence operating at a high level, quietly building a psychological profile over time. In the early stages, empath gives the benefit of the doubt. That's almost automatic. They assume good intent. They fill in the gaps with optimism. When someone lies, they consider the possibility that there's a reason. When someone manipulates, they look for the wound behind the behavior. This is why empaths stay longer than they should. Not because they don't see the problem, but because they understand it too well. But understanding does not mean ignoring. And this is where the shift begins. Every broken promise gets logged. Every subtle act of disrespect gets stored. Every moment where something felt off but couldn't yet be proven at all goes somewhere. Not into confrontation, not into conflict, but into observation. And over time, a pattern emerges. What was once a series of isolated incidents starts to connect into a clear structure. The empath begins to see that this isn't random behavior, it's consistent, predictable, intentional, or at the very least unchanging. At this point, something critical happens. The empath stops asking, why are they like this? And starts asking, why am I still here? That question is dangerous not emotionally, but logically. Because once the empath turns their attention inward, the dynamic begins to shift. They are no longer focused on fixing the other person. They're analyzing their own participation in the pattern. And with that awareness comes clarity. Clarity strips away illusion. It removes the stories we tell ourselves to justify staying. It exposes the gap between what someone says and what they consistently do. This is the moment where compassion begins to transform. Not disappear, but evolve. Because there's a misconception that when an empath becomes fed up, they lose their empathy. That's not true. What they lose is their willingness to misapply it. They start to recognize that empathy without boundaries becomes self-destruction. That understanding someone's pain does not require tolerating their behavior. That being compassionate does not mean being available for manipulation. So the emotional energy that was once directed outward toward fixing, helping, understanding begins to turn inward, toward protection, toward self-respect, toward alignment with reality instead of hope. And this transition is almost invisible to the person on the receiving end, because the empath doesn't announce it. They don't make a scene. They don't issue ultimatums. They simply start seeing clearly. And once someone sees clearly, they cannot unsee. This is why the buildup matters so much. Because by the time the empath reaches the point of being fed up, they are no longer reacting emotionally in the way people expect. They are operating from a position of informed awareness. They've already run the scenarios. They've already tested the patterns. They've already given more chances than most people would. So when the shift happens, it feels sudden to everyone else but to the empath. It's the most logical conclusion in the world. There's no confusion left, no internal debate, no need for closure from the other person, because the closure came from observation. And that's what makes this stage so powerful and so underestimated. A narcissist relies on unpredictability, on keeping others emotionally off balance. But a fed-up empath is no longer off balance. They've moved past reaction and into recognition. They are no longer trying to figure the other person out. They already have. And once that happens, the entire game changes because the empath is no longer participating in it. So if you're trying to understand why a fed-up empath becomes so formidable, don't look at the moment they walk away. Look at everything that happened before that moment, the quiet observations, the internal calculations, the gradual shift from emotion to clarity. Because by the time they leave, they're not acting on impulse. They're acting on truth. If the first shift is awareness, the second is far more unsettling for both sides. Because what follows clarity is not anger, not confrontation, not revenge. It's something much quieter and far more decisive. It's detachment. Most people assume that when someone has had enough, they'll express it loudly. They'll argue, demand change, draw a line in the sand. But that assumption comes from a misunderstanding of how power actually operates in human dynamics. Emotional reactions, whether positive or negative, still signal engagement. They keep the connection alive, and for someone who thrives on control, attention, or validation, even conflict is a form of access. This is why a narcissistic personality doesn't necessarily fear anger. Anger is predictable. It can be provoked, redirected, manipulated. It creates a loop action, reaction, escalation that keeps both people psychologically entangled. As long as that loop exists, the dynamic continues. But detachment breaks the loop entirely. When an empath reaches this stage, they are no longer trying to win, fix, or even be understood. That entire framework collapses. The internal question is no longer, how do I make this work? But why am I investing energy here at all? And once that question is answered honestly, the behavior that follows becomes almost inevitable. You'll notice the changes, but they won't come with an explanation. The empath stops over-explaining, stops defending their intentions, stops engaging in circular conversations that never lead anywhere. The emotional intensity that once defined the interaction begins to fade, not replaced by hostility, but by neutrality. And neutrality is deeply destabilizing to someone who depends on emotional leverage, because now there's nothing to hook into, no visible wound to press on, no reaction to amplify. These strategies that once worked, guilt, charm, pressure, withdrawal, start to fail, not because the empath is resisting them, but because they are no longer responsive to them. This is a critical distinction. Resistance still implies engagement. Detachment removes the need to resist in the first place. From a psychological standpoint, what's happening here is a withdrawal of reinforcement. Every dynamic between two people is maintained by some form of feedback, attention, emotion, validation. When one person stops providing that feedback, the system begins to destabilize. The behaviors that were once rewarded no longer produce results. And when that happens, the person on the other side often escalates, not out of strategy, but out of confusion. They push harder, test boundaries more aggressively, attempt to provoke a reaction, any reaction, because the absence of response feels like a loss of control. But the empath at this stage is no longer operating within that system. They've stepped outside of it. What makes this particularly powerful is that it doesn't require force. There's no confrontation necessary, no dramatic exit. The empath simply becomes unavailable in the ways that once sustained the connection. Conversations become shorter. Emotional investment becomes minimal. The energy shifts from outward engagement to inward stability. And this is where people often misinterpret what they're seeing. They assume the empath has become cold, distant, or indifferent in a negative sense. But what's actually happening is a reallocation of attention. The empath is no longer distributing their emotional resources indiscriminately. They're choosing where those resources go, and more importantly, where they don't go. That choice is what redefines the power dynamic. Because power in its simplest form is control over where attention flows. And when an empath withdraws that attention, they are no longer participating in a system that diminishes them. They are no longer available for manipulation, not because they've become defensive, but because they've become selective. This selectivity is often perceived as final, and in many cases, it is. When an empath reaches true detachment, there's a noticeable absence of internal conflict. They're not going back and forth, not second-guessing, not waiting for the other person to change. That phase has already passed. The decision has already been made internally long before it becomes visible externally. So when the distance appears, it feels sudden, but it's actually the result of a long, quiet process reaching its conclusion. And here's the part that's difficult for many people to accept. Once this level of detachment is established, it rarely reverses. Because it's not based on emotion, it's based on understanding. The empath has seen the pattern clearly, recognized their role within it, and made a conscious decision to step out. Re-engaging would require ignoring that understanding. And once awareness reaches a certain level, that kind of self-deception becomes almost impossible. So the silence remains, the distance remains, not as a tactic, not as a punishment, but as a natural consequence of clarity. And for someone who relied on emotional access, That silence can feel more disruptive than any argument ever could, because there's nothing to respond to, nothing to manipulate, nothing to regain control over. Just absence. And absence in this context is not emptiness. It's resolution. So if you're looking at this dynamic from the outside, trying to understand where the real shift happens, don't focus on the moment the empath walks away physically. Focus on the moment they stop reacting emotionally, because that's when the connection actually ends. And once someone reaches the point where your presence no longer changes their internal state, you're not losing an argument, you're losing access. Once detachment takes hold, something even more structured begins to emerge. It's not just that the empath has stepped back emotionally, they begin to reorganize how they operate entirely. And this is where most people underestimate them, because they're still thinking in terms of personality, not in terms of asterisk standards asterisk. An empath, by nature, is open, receptive, generous with time, energy, and understanding. But when that openness is repeatedly exploited, it doesn't disappear, it becomes refined. It becomes selective, and eventually it becomes disciplined. What you start to see is a shift from instinctive giving to intentional allowance. Before, access to the empath was easy. You didn't have to qualify for it, you didn't have to earn it. Their default setting was connection. They would meet people where they were, often lowering their own expectations in order to maintain harmony. But after the awareness and detachment phases, that model no longer makes sense to them, because now they've seen the cost. They've experienced what happens when boundaries are implied but not enforced, when empathy is extended without evaluation, when understanding is given to people who use it as a tool rather than receiving it as a gift. And once those patterns become clear, the empath begins to reconstruct their internal rules, not emotionally, but logically. They start asking different questions. Not, how can I help this person, but does this person respect what I offer? Not, what are they going through, but how do they behave when things don't go their way? The focus shifts from intention to behavior, from words to patterns, from potential to reality. And from that shift, boundaries are born. But these aren't the kind of boundaries most people talk about: verbal, negotiable, dependent on compliance. These are internal boundaries, quiet, firm, and non-negotiable. They don't require explanation because they're not designed to change the other person. They're designed to regulate access. That's the key difference. A boundary is not a request, it's a filter. And once an empath begins to operate with that understanding, their entire presence changes. They become harder to read, not because they're hiding anything, but because they're no longer broadcasting everything. Their emotional availability is no longer constant, it's conditional. You'll notice it in small ways first. They don't respond immediately. They don't engage in every conversation. They don't feel obligated to maintain connections that drain them. There's a pause now, a moment of evaluation before they give their time or energy. That pause is where their power lives, because it interrupts the automatic patterns that used to define their behavior. It creates space between stimulus and response, and in that space, they choose differently. And those choices compound. They start saying no without over-explaining. They disengage without guilt. They observe without feeling the need to intervene. And over time, this creates a version of the empath that operates with precision rather than impulse. To someone who relied on their previous openness, this feels like a complete transformation. The same person who once tolerated inconsistency now rejects it immediately. The same person who once gave endless chances now sets limits after the first clear pattern. The same person who once prioritized harmony now prioritizes alignment. And here's where it becomes particularly difficult for a narcissistic dynamic to survive, because manipulation depends on access. It depends on emotional openings, on blurred boundaries, on the ability to test limits without consequence. But when an empath enforces boundaries internally, those openings disappear. There's no argument to win, because the empath isn't negotiating. There's no guilt to leverage, because the empath isn't overinvested. There's no confusion to exploit, because the empath is no longer ignoring what they see. Everything becomes clear, simple, and direct. If a behavior doesn't align, access is reduced. If the pattern continues, access is removed. No escalation, no drama, just adjustment. And that adjustment is what makes this stage so effective. It doesn't rely on controlling the other person, it relies on controlling participation. The empath is no longer trying to change the dynamic. They're deciding whether or not to be part of it. That decision point is where their autonomy is restored. And autonomy is something that cannot be manipulated once it's fully claimed, because at that point, the empath is no longer reacting to external pressure. They're operating from internal standards. Their behavior is guided by principles rather than emotions, by observation rather than assumption. This doesn't make them cold. It makes them consistent. It doesn't make them distant. It makes them intentional. And intention is what transforms empathy from a vulnerability into a form of strength. Now, instead of being accessible to everyone, they are available only to those who meet a certain level of respect, honesty, and reciprocity. Their energy is no longer scattered, it's directed. Their time is no longer given, it's invested. And once that shift happens, the dynamic changes permanently. Because the empath is no longer someone you can gradually wear down, subtly influence. They are someone who evaluates, decides, and acts based on a clear internal framework. And if you don't meet that framework, there's nothing to negotiate. You simply don't get access. So when people ask what makes a fed-up empath dangerous, they're usually expecting something emotional: anger, retaliation, intensity. But that's not where the real shift is. The real shift is in discipline. It's in the quiet, consistent enforcement of standards that no longer bend under pressure, guilt, or familiarity. It's in the ability to walk away not out of emotion, but out of alignment. Because once someone learns to protect their energy without needing permission, they are no longer easy to control. And the moment you stop negotiating your worth is the moment your entire reality begins to reorganize around it. By the time an empath reaches this final stage, something fundamental has changed, and it's not just their behavior, it's their orientation to reality itself. What began as sensitivity has now been refined into perception. What once felt like emotional overwhelm has been organized into pattern recognition. And what used to be a vulnerability has become a form of precision. This is where people get it completely wrong. They assume the empath has become hardened, cynical, or closed off. But that's not what's happening. What's actually happening is integration. The empath hasn't lost their ability to feel. They've learned how to filter what they feel, where they invest it, and why. All the experiences that once confused them now serve a purpose. Every inconsistency they tolerated, every moment they second-guessed their intuition. Every time they gave someone the benefit of the doubt when it wasn't earned, those moments are no longer sources of regret. They become reference points, and reference points create accuracy. Now, when the empath enters a new interaction, they're not starting from zero. They're not evaluating people based on isolated impressions or emotional impulses. They're scanning for patterns, dash tone shifts, behavioral inconsistencies, subtle attempts at control or influence. Not in a paranoid way, but in a calibrated, observational way. They don't need to confront everything they notice. They don't need to prove anything. They simply see it. And seeing it changes everything. Because once perception reaches that level, manipulation becomes extremely difficult. Most manipulative behavior relies on misdirection, on the other person either not noticing the pattern or noticing it too late. But the evolved empath notices early, sometimes immediately. They pick up on what isn't being said just as clearly as what is. They recognize when words and actions don't align. They detect when someone is testing boundaries, even subtly. And instead of reacting emotionally, they adjust strategically. That's the shift. Before, the empath responded. Now they choose. And that choice is informed by experience, not by hope. Hope is what kept. They engaged in the past. Hope that things would change, that intentions would match behavior, that understanding would lead to growth. But in this stage, hope is no longer the driving force. Reality is, they evaluate people based on consistency, not potential, on actions, not explanations, on patterns, not promises. And this creates a version of the empath that is incredibly grounded. There's no urgency in their decisions. No need to rush into trust or connection. They're comfortable observing, comfortable waiting, comfortable letting people reveal themselves over time. And because of that patience, they rarely misjudge in the way they once did. This doesn't mean they never get it wrong, but when they do, the correction is immediate. There's no prolonged denial, no internal negotiation to justify staying in a misaligned situation. The feedback loop is shorter, cleaner, more efficient. And this efficiency is what makes them so difficult to deceive, because deception requires time. It requires space to build a narrative, to create an illusion, to establish a version of reality that isn't entirely accurate. But the evolved empath doesn't give that space easily. They're attentive to the small details, the early signals, the subtle contradictions that most people overlook. They don't need a dramatic event to recognize a problem. A pattern is enough. And once the pattern is clear, the decision is made. What's important to understand here is that this transformation doesn't eliminate empathy, it stabilizes it. The empath still cares. They still understand. They still have the capacity to connect deeply. But now, that capacity is paired with discernment. They no longer confuse empathy with obligation. They no longer believe that understanding someone means tolerating their behavior. They no longer assume that emotional depth should come at the cost of self-respect. Instead, they operate from a position where empathy and boundaries coexist, where awareness guides emotion, rather than being overridden by it. And this balance is what creates a kind of quiet authority. You'll notice it in how they communicate directly, but not aggressively. Clear, but not defensive. They don't over-explain because they're not seeking validation. They don't overreact because they're not easily destabilized. Their presence becomes steady, consistent, difficult to disrupt. And that stability has an impact. People who are used to emotional volatility don't quite know how to engage with it. There's nothing to escalate, nothing to manipulate, nothing to pull apart. The usual strategies don't apply because the empath is no longer playing the same game. They've stepped into a different framework, entirely one based on alignment, clarity, and self-regulation. And within that framework, their decisions become simple. If something aligns, they move toward it. If it doesn't, they move away. No drama, no confusion, no need for prolonged analysis once the pattern is established. That simplicity is the result of everything that came before